morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks for hanging in last day of the conference. We very much appreciate you all being here. My name is Heidi Wax. I am a managing director with a company called Stroz Friedberg, and this is my colleague, Mitch Green.
Hey guys, my name is Mitch. I'm a manager with Stroz Friedberg's Digital Forensics and Incident Response practice.
And so we come from a background of digital forensics and incident response. My background personally is I'm an attorney by training, so that means we have to give lots and lots of disclaimers and caveats as we get started. So number one, we're not here to give legal advice. We don't work for a law firm. We work for a cybersecurity consulting firm. Number two, if you have any questions, we'll take them at the end and be happy to answer them. But again, nothing that we will be saying is intended as legal advice. We're here today to talk to you about online tracking technologies, pixels, beacons, cookies, and the like. We will kick it off and get started. So how did we get here? Why are we here talking about this today? Why are we talking about this at RSA? It has become sort of the perfect confluence, as often happens, between law and technology. And what does that mean for technologists? What does that mean for the people who run and operate websites? What does that mean for attorneys and compliance officers who work for organizations that have websites? When we talk about this with our clients, we basically say, like, do you have a website? Then you might want to think about this. It's a moving target. This area is changing so completely and totally rapidly that the new advice was just issued last week by both the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Health and Human Services. So this area is shifting rapidly, made putting together a PowerPoint a little bit difficult and complicated. So we had to save a lot for talking points and in the talk track. Basically, this sort of is an evolution, right? So this started with cookies and pixels, and has evolved since that time. There is a disconnect between what's happening with the technical teams and marketing teams and the legal teams. So marketing teams are the ones oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes who are implementing these technologies on company and organization websites, and they're not always communicating what they're plugging into the websites with their legal counterparts or the people who own, for example, the privacy notice. And that is creating a disconnect between what's being said and stated publicly about an organization or a company's website or mobile app practices and what's actually happening on the website. So I think the other thing we want to talk about a little bit is, like, what brought us here? Why are we the people who are here talking to you about it? Why are two people from a digital forensics and incident response company here to talk about this subject matter? And what happened is we had some longstanding clients who we had done a number of engagements for, investigations of all shapes and sizes, incident response investigations, who came to us when they were on the receiving end of an enforcement action. So a state or a federal regulator came to them and said, we're investigating you for your use of these technologies. And these clients were caught flat-footed because this was a very quickly evolving area. And they came to us as their trusted advisors for technical investigations and said, we actually don't know that we know what's happening on our website. And the regulators are now asking us questions. Can you help us figure it out? And we leveraged, and Mitch, much to his credit, leveraged his deep technical expertise from conducting these types of investigations, all sorts of privacy-related investigations, forensic investigations, our knowledge and understanding. We collaborated. We have a security testing team, a pen testing team. We collaborated across our firm with people who have lots of technical expertise in investigations, in code review, in app design, and said, how do we break this apart? How do we basically reverse engineer this to figure out what's actually happening in these digital properties, and how much can we actually figure out on these technical properties?
And we're going to get a little bit more into that later on in the slide deck here.
Yeah.
But we're going to start by setting the stage on really why did the state enforcement actions come to be? Why are they targeting certain entities and not others? and really what is driving that need for the state enforcement action, and then ultimately, what are the various levers that are being utilized here to drive that enforcement action.
So in some ways, this is a very US-centric issue that has heightened it. It is being driven by two things that are uniquely US. One is our patchwork quilt of regulations and privacy regulations and enforcement, people in enforcement roles, both at the state and federal level. And two is our love in the United States of class action lawsuits. And so those two things sort of converged at the same time. And what really kicked this off is that in 2022, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, rendered a decision in a case called Dobbs, and it overturned the longstanding previous decision in Roe v. Wade. And so almost instantly overnight, in a number of states in the United States, certain types of healthcare for women, including abortion, became de facto illegal because it reverted to whatever state law was on the books. And since Roe v. Wade had been in practice since the 1970s, many states had not actually revisited those laws. And the Department of Health and Human Services sort of rushed in to give guidance called the Bulletin, to give guidance to healthcare providers in particular, who are under their purview, about what data should and should not be collected when visitors come to their websites, out of concern that people might misuse that information or try and obtain information about women and other visitors to those websites under sort of the new legal regime that we were operating in. So HHS issues this bulletin, and the bulletin said, like, don't do this, don't do that, don't collect this. If you're doing this, you have to notify people. You have to tell people what you're doing. And that then led to our second favorite thing, which is a flood of class action lawsuits. So a number of law firms and attorneys went looking at healthcare sites. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, you can there are ways you can see from the outside using free commercial tools and get a sense of what might be operating on a website or a mobile app and what data it might be those technologies might be trying to collect. And class action attorneys looked at that and said, well, these healthcare organizations look like a good target for some class action litigation because we see this operating on the site. And at the same time, some state attorneys general and some other enforcement organizations were doing the same thing. So it wound up to a place where healthcare organizations in particular were scrambling to figure out what was actually going on their websites while they were in process. We had one matter what we were working on, and they came to us preemptively, and while we were doing the investigation, the class action lawsuit was filed. So this was all happening in real time.
I want to zoom out really quick because healthcare is not the only area where we're seeing this risk. The OCR bulletin is not the only piece that is driving this. There was really a convergence here that kind of brought this to the forefront, which was wiretapping, VPPA. We've seen a lot of those. Many of you may also be familiar with the session recording technologies and the class action lawsuits and litigation that has ensued from that. So when we take a look at all of these various drivers of this interest, this litigation, this regulator inquiry, there's a number of things. And what really dragged us and brought us into this was the healthcare aspect, being that it's a highly regulated industry. But as we take a step back and look at what we're applying here with some of our trusted partners and customers in that industry, it's really applicable to a lot of these various different regulated industries and the various legal theories that are being applied and driving that interest.
That's right. And I think what's really important here is that the plaintiffs bar, the class action lawyers, are sort of testing out all these legal theories to see what might work and what might stick. And that is taking some time as well. And so there's no silver bullet. There's no straight up guidance. If you do X, Y, and Z, you will be prevented or you will be successful in defending or in fending off a lawsuit, because they are trying all these combinations of legal theories. So for example, the Video Privacy Protection Act is one law that they have discovered. For those of you who are not familiar with the VPPA, it is a law that was enacted in 1988. It was enacted like in a very short period of time, and for those of you who follow the United States Congress, nothing really happens quickly. And so what happened is President Ronald Reagan nominated somebody to be this guy named Robert Bork to be a Supreme Court justice. And a local reporter, he lived in Washington, D.C., and a local reporter went to a videotape rental store, a local chain, in the days before there was even Blockbuster Video, and just walked up and said, I would like the list of videos that this guy has rented. Can you give me the list of videos? And they literally printed it out and gave him a photocopy of handwritten records from this local video store, and they published it in a local paper. And there was nothing super salacious in there or anything like that, but people freaked out. People being Congress people freaked out that you could get this information, and they passed the law very, very quickly that is very narrowly scoped, specifically to videotape service providers. And we are still operating in a regime all these years later where this law is still on the books and people are finding new and creative ways to apply it to what we're seeing in current technology and in today.
And we'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, but that is a particularly prevalent problem in video streaming sites and in mobile apps. There's an important distinction there that it applies to subscribers of that site. So there's been some interesting defenses that have come up, not to get too much into the legal side here, arguing what is a subscriber of those sites. But to translate that to the technical failure that is allowing for that unauthorized disclosure of information, right? We frequently see that we go to a website, we watch a video, maybe the title of that video is in the title page of the page that you're viewing. Well, now all of a sudden, popular analytic tools out there, most of these tools out there today will capture the title of the page that you're looking at, and therefore that is a disclosure of the title of the video, which is one of those protected pieces of information under the VPPA as it's been interpreted on modern technologies. So there's lots of really special ways that some old regulations being interpreted and applied to modern day technologies, and surely that'll change in the future, but we are here today navigating the nuances and the challenges of these applications of these pieces of regulation.
Yeah, that's right. So as I mentioned, in the United States, we have this sort of patchwork situation that leads to litigation risk for these organizations that use these technologies, which is basically everyone. And as Mitch mentioned, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, as Mitch mentioned, this is not just sticking to the healthcare sector. Again, we love a class action litigation, and other sectors are now sort of getting that attention. This one happened last year where Congress held a hearing when they found out that a number of these tax prep companies also had these technologies embedded on their websites and were collecting and transmitting that information. One thing that we should say is that non-technical people seem to be discovering that these technologies exist and that they're operating on websites, whereas many of us who work in the privacy and security space, web design space, social media space, have been well aware of these technologies for quite some time. But what is important to remember is we're definitely not here to demonize online tracking technologies. There are actually quite a number of legitimate uses for them for people who own and operate websites, who need to track metrics, who need to understand, these technologies, in addition to collecting and transmitting sometimes personal information and IP addresses, also do things like what size screen is somebody typically viewing our website on? Are we sure that it's sort of the resolution is correct? If we're mostly viewed on a mobile device versus a desktop computer, is it showing correctly? What kind of traffic load are we getting to different pieces of our web presence, to our mobile app? So there are very, very legitimate uses of these technologies, and there are many, many providers out there. We're certainly not here to demonize any one of the providers. So that's another piece of this puzzle that's sort of getting lost when everyone is freaking out about the use of pixels.
I think there's an important piece there, which is many cases, this is not an intentional transmission of this data to these third parties. In most cases that we've seen here, it's inadvertent due to the nature of the way that the tracking technology or analytic tool works. That is data that is required for it to function, that it is inadvertently exposing it. And so in many cases, it's not that the tool is bad. It's not that the site is flawed. It's that maybe there's more nuance to it, and the specific implementation of that tool on this particular entity's site needs to be adjusted to be more appropriate and in line with the applicable regulations.
That's right.
So we've covered the landscape, a little bit about how we got here. Let's get a little bit technical here and talk about, for those in the room who may not know, what are cookies, what are pixels, what are trackers, scripts, and you may even have heard of beacons. These are all terms that are getting thrown around pretty quickly and oftentimes interchangeably here. Cookies are where a lot of this started, and everyone's concerned about cookies, bits of data being left behind. But really, those are only a fraction of the bigger picture here, right? So we all know that cookies are essentially these little bits of data that a website can set within your browser, and these are often required for key functionalities of a website. Pixels, it's really another name for trackers and scripts. It's all synonymous now today. But the origin of web tracking, analytics, is in these really one-by-one clear GIF pixels that would be embedded onto a website. Third party would watch how many times that was loaded, and you could count how many times a web page was visited. That tracking and analytic technology has evolved over the years to become more robust and more capable, offering the website operators more information about how users are using their site, where they're accessing it from, and with what devices. That's really valuable information, not only for content developers, website maintainers, but also for advertisers too. Beacons are really an extension of that tracking technology as well. So we see these terms often thrown around interchangeably, but we're going to hopefully explain how that evolution has taken place and how that's resulting in this often inadvertent transmission of data that may be regulated.
And I'll just chime in that you'll see when you look at guidance that comes out, from example, from HHS, Health and Human Services, from the Federal Trade Commission, the guidance is referring to the umbrella term of online tracking technologies.
Yes.
That term has also sort of caught on with a number of policy organizations and membership organizations that are giving advice to their members about how to approach this. So at this point, although they operate differently, and Mitch is going to go into that, the guidance that's coming from lawyers is kind of coming at a much higher level and bucketing them all together.
That's a really good point. Tracking technologies is being used to describe the intent of the technology, whether it is tracking users, but also more broadly to anything that is tracking information about a website. And so one of the interesting areas where we see this term also apply to is things like application performance monitoring tools. We've all heard of New Relic or Sentry. Those aren't designed to be tools that are tracking a user, but they are all lumped into this same umbrella category of online tracking technologies that this regulation and this need for greater visibility applies to. So really quickly on cookies, this is, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention this. There's really two key types of cookies here, first party and third party. Now, first party cookies are, essential functionality cookies. When you go to a website, let's say you click that remember me button on a login page so that next time it remembers who you are, maybe pre-populates your username in the login field. That's often a cookie. That cookie is being set by the website that you're accessing. But we also have third-party cookies. Third-party cookies are set by embedded code or scripts that are on your website. Those third-party cookies can also be set by other websites you go to. And an example that I like to use is, let's say you go to a social media site and you log in. That social media site is going to set a cookie in your browser so it knows who you are next time you come visit the page. That might be a session identifier, maybe a username, or some other kind of unique identifier for you as a user. But now when you go visit Mom and Pop Bakery's website and they have that social tracking pixel or tracking script on their site, it now knows who you are. But what if you're not logged in? Well, maybe the first time you go to a site with that tracking script on it, it drops a cookie. So that way, next time it sees you, it knows who you are. But it doesn't know which user in their vast data set of users you are. And so they're going to try and pick up signals as you browse the web. It'll follow you around. And as we see here, in a case that we worked, This is an example of some of the data that we saw transmitted when a user submitted a contact form on a website. That contact form submitted hashed cryptographic representations of data that the user submitted to the contact form to the social media company. Why did it do that? It did this so that the social media company can tie that anonymous user that it's seeing browse the web back to a user in their data set. And this seems all fine and well, really well intentioned, right? You're helping the website operators who are deploying this technology to better identify the users accessing their website, so maybe we can remarket to them later. But what if this was a healthcare website? What if this accidentally picked up sensitive healthcare information that was being sent? This technology is often referred to by a lot of these pixels and tracking technologies as their advanced matching capability. This is something that we see commonly in a lot of social pixels or trackers, but we're seeing this expand to other products like CDPs, customer data platforms, and otherwise, all in the interest of better understanding who's interacting with your content online. So this is an example of what's really spurring a lot of this interest. And when we talk about the inadvertent transmission of data to a third party, this is often what's happening under the hood and behind the scenes. So what does a pixel or tracking tag look like? Well, there's a couple different flavors out there. As I had mentioned, these image-based truly pixels are where we really got started years ago in its early stages. You would simply embed a small image on your site from a third-party server. And when that was loaded, the logs on that server where it was being fetched from would show who was fetching it. And you might include, as we'll talk about in a minute, some query parameters, some extra bits of data in that URL to uniquely identify which site, which property that's being loaded from. As this has evolved over the years and the need to collect more information, more granular information, more detailed information about the users and the devices that they're accessing your content from, that's where these JavaScript scripts have really come into play. These scripts are loaded from these third-party servers, and then they send that data back home to the tracking server. And so, as we'll talk about in a minute here, we can use processes and technologies in order to inspect this kind of flow of trackers being loaded and data being sent out to third parties. There's also iframe-based pixels and tracker scripts out there that you may see from time to time, but in my experience, those are not as popular as the image-based or the JavaScript-based tags. So here's an example flow, as I talked about for the image-based pixel. You go visit a web server, load a page. Well, that pixel is being loaded from a third-party site or server. And that server has logs of who's loading that pixel. And so think about that. We can do some analytics on those logs. We can figure out, okay, how many times has that pixel been loaded? And if that pixel is unique to a particular web property, then we can tell them X number of users have visited that page. Pretty simple. So how does it send that data? How does it uniquely identify itself? Oops, sorry, getting ahead of myself here. So there's a lot of these different providers out here. In fact, this is just a small number of the many popular technologies that are out there. We have social pixels like LinkedIn, Meta. We have analytic tools like Google Analytics and Heap. As I mentioned, New Relic, oftentimes application performance monitoring. There's a lot of these different tools. These are often used, again, not for nefarious or malicious purposes, but rather well-intentioned website operators looking to better market to their users and better tune their content to the people who are interacting with their sites. As I mentioned, the capability that's really causing a lot of the concern in terms of user privacy is this advanced matching capability where it can grab content submitted by users to forms on a site in order to try and identify who that user is. That's where we're getting a lot of the concern and trouble from. So that is a capability to look out for. And if you think about that, if you're evaluating what are we implementing on our site, one thing to look out for, does this product have advanced matching? Is the group or specific page where we're implementing that technology an appropriate place for that to exist? So there's a lot, and this is just a small number. What's driving this proliferation, this explosion in the number of technologies out there? These are just three of the key drivers that we're seeing. It is lack of data portability, right? Every platform wants you to deploy their tracking script, their pixel, their tag to your site so that they can get your data. But that data, once it's collected, you often can't ship that to another provider. So there's a lack of interoperability and data portability going on behind the scenes there. These providers are also making it increasingly easier for the marketing teams and the website operators to deploy this technology with limited to no knowledge required of programming or web technologies. And lastly, they're free in many cases. These technologies, you go out there and it's free to deploy on your site, and you get instant analytics and insight into your user behavior, your marketing trends, and so forth. And this is something that we have to remind ourselves of. If you're not paying for it, you might be the product, or your data might be the product. So all things to watch out for here. And so with this proliferation of all of these tags and scripts, how do we manage all of that? Well, that's where tag managers come in. One of the popular solutions that we have out here is Google Tag Manager that we see frequently, but there's other emerging solutions out there that offer this capability. A tag manager allows the team to have more structure to how they deploy these tags consistently across a site that may have many dozens or even thousands of pages on it. Right? We don't want to have to go update all of those pages, so how do we do that? With a tag manager. But one of the risks that we're seeing is when things get implemented outside the bounds of the tag manager. Maybe it's one specific marketing campaign. Oh, we're just going to go deploy this one tag there. Or hey, this is John Doe's portion of the site over here. He's going to do what he wants. So now all of a sudden, you think you know what's deployed to your site. You go look at your tag manager. We write, our privacy policy may be based on that. But all of a sudden, whoops, there's all these trackers that we forgot about in this corner of the site. Or that old site that came from a merger and acquisition that got merged into our web property. Or maybe even, as we'll get into in a minute, what about third-party platforms that make up parts of your digital footprint? All of these are areas that you need to consider what is deployed to, and do you have visibility into what technologies are deployed and being used in those areas? So how does a tracker or a script send data? And what can we look for to identify the presence of these trackers and the data that's being sent? There's two main ways that these trackers are really sending data, and that is, to get a little bit more technical here, a GET request, HTTP GET, or an HTTP POST request. So in a GET request, that's where we are most often using that to fetch content from a server, but you can also use that to send data using query parameters in a URL. Query parameters are simply keys and values that get appended to a URL. So if we think about that there, we could maybe add in, hey, this is site ID, and then give it a unique ID. We could maybe even add in a specific campaign ID that this is associated with that. As we talked about, screen resolution is something that a lot of these tools track. So we could add a parameter in there, measure that with JavaScript, and shove it in a URL and send it to the server. So a lot of data can be sent here. With GET requests and trackers that use these, it's a little easier for us to inspect what data is being sent to these third parties. But a growing number of these solutions are using HTTP POST requests, right, where we can send a ton of data in the body of a request. When we see all this data being sent in the body, oftentimes it's obfuscated. That could be for a number of reasons. Maybe they don't. They want to make it more efficient. They want to compress it, reduce the size of the data that they're sending, all well-intentioned. Or what if they wanted to obfuscate and hide the data that they're tracking and sending? This is an example here. Let's see if I've got a laser. That's a structure that, from our experience as investigators, we recognize as base64. It's a way to encode data. And when we decode that data, we get this. We see various data points that are being tracked about the user's interaction with this page. We get things like an IP address and a user agent. This tells that tracking server a little bit about who's interacting with that content. And these are benign. These are okay things. These are normal things that scripts track. But what if it was more sensitive information that was being tracked and encoded and obfuscated into here? Or what if this tracking solution chose to encrypt the data in a way that we can't decode it and see what's being tracked? These are all considerations when it comes to really the identification of tracking technologies and websites, and ultimately the assessment of what types of information and pieces of data are being transmitted to third parties here. So we've covered a little bit about the technology, how it works, what's enabling it, what kinds of data we see being tracked, and how we see it being sent to these tracking servers. So, we kind of take ourselves back to a client first coming to us and saying, help, We've got
going on my website? I
What's
have no
going on
idea.
my website? We don't know. So how do we look at a website and see what's on there? Well, so if you go to a web page, you can open up developer tools. And developer tools let you see things like the source code of a web page, maybe the network requests that are happening on that page. And this is great for a single web page. But what if we have a site that has 1,000 pages on it or thousands of pages on it? How do we scale this? And how do we scan a website for the presence of tracking technologies? That's the million-dollar question right here. Well, there's a number of commercial solutions out there that do offer tracking tech identification. In fact, there's some commercial products out here that help you manage those technologies in your website and user consent. We're not going to get into all of that, but these are some popular technologies that you hear people talking about when it comes to identification of tracking technologies, these scripts, these pixels on websites. There's a lot of other providers out there. These are just a few. I think the one that we most commonly hear people using when they kind of start to scratch the surface on this is, Ghostery. It's a great browser extension that lets you see what pixels, scripts, trackers are firing on a page.
By the way, if you've never tried those tools, you might be in for a little bit of a surprise. As soon as you turn it on and you start visiting websites, you get a pop-up with all the different things that are operating on every site that you go to. And I think it is a little bit jarring the first time you play around with these tools.
It can be. And Ghostery is a great tool if you want to become more privacy conscious, reduce the amount of trackers that are being used when you're browsing the web. It's a tool you can do it. Transcend and OneTrust are really for more helping organizations get a grasp on their usage of technologies on their website and managing the consent associated with it. But in these cases, the clients who are coming to us don't already have these technologies implemented, don't have deals, contracts worked out, and so we thought about how do we scale this to the rest of their website, and there were two key other areas that we wanted to solve for: mobile apps and applications that are portions of an application or website that are behind a login. These tools work.
We should
great.
also point out that part of the reason for that is that in the guidance from the Department of Health and Human Services, they actually break out what they recommend you should and shouldn't be doing pre-authentication and post-authentication. So in the healthcare sector, obviously it's very common that you would have a portal and you would go to your doctor's provider or your insurance provider and there's all sorts of things you can do on the website before you log in as a visitor, say for example to look at visiting hours at a hospital or something like that. But then when you authenticate, you might be looking at your own medical records, you might be looking at messages between you and your healthcare provider. And so we kept running into this issue with how do we scale? It was easier a little bit to scale pre-authentication versus post-authentication.
Yeah, that's right. So, as this evolved and as our clients' needs evolved, we started to develop our own solution to this. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So what we're doing was actually nothing that proprietary. Like I like to say, we really took a number of off-the-shelf solutions and really built the glue between it. We built a solution based off of an open source product called OpenWPM, Open Web Privacy Measurement Framework. Really powerful open source tool out there for doing just this, interacting with a page and measuring what happens when you interact with it. And the really powerful part about that is that tool is able to store the collected data in a database with a convenient schema that we can then run all types of analytics over to perform that identification of tracking technologies being loaded on a page in a very similar manner to how the Ghosteries, the OneTrust, and the Transcend type products are able to look at the network requests on a page and identify those technologies as well. So the process starts with an enumeration of a website. Right? We have to find all the pages that we need to scan, and then we use a tool like OpenWPM to actually perform automated interaction with those pages and collect data about what happens when we load those pages in a browser, looking at things like network requests being made, cookies that are being set, and other types of activity. So once we've collected all that data, now we have to do the analytics on it and figure out, well, what's a tracker? There's a couple ways that we can do that. We can look at purely just what is a third-party request? What data, assets, images, otherwise are being loaded from domains other than the one that I started looking at. But we can also take open source data sets on trackers, right? There's plenty of these data sets and lists out there on known tracking URLs, sites, products, and we can run that against this data and flag things that we know to be trackers. But we can also look at data that's being sent back and forth for patterns, keywords, or use other logic to flag requests that might be trackers or look like this is data being sent to a third party. Right, as we talked about, screen size is a pretty predictable parameter in terms of what is commonly tracked. So we could go look through this data that we collect for, let's say we are doing our collection with a browser is 1920 by 1080 pixels, so we can go look through the data set. We can code that a couple different ways and search that. Well, hey, that might be a really great way to find that. We apply a couple different layers of analysis to this collected data to give us the best chances of finding those tracking technologies. And oh, by the way, we can do this on mobile apps too. So if we take a slightly different approach to collecting the information, we can apply the same analysis to that by using a man-in-the-middle proxy. So right, I can fire up the app on my phone. I can connect my phone and monitor the traffic going back and forth. And then we can run the same type of analysis on that, looking at the data that's being transmitted, the URLs that are being requested. And then we can provide insight into, well, when I load this mobile app, here we see these pixels, trackers, scripts firing, and here's data that's being sent back and forth. So it's it's evolving. It is, the need is ever changing, as is the litigation, the legal theories that are being applied. But this is a solid foundation that we base our, offering our solutions, helping clients on, and has really allowed us to go quite far in terms of our discovery of just how many of these products are out there, how they're working, and what we need to be concerned about in terms of implementation of these projects.
Yeah, and I think one thing we may want to just sort of caveat is that there are limitations.
Yes.
Many of these technologies obfuscate what they are doing and what they are collecting by design for their own intellectual property reasons, for their own trade secret reasons, again, not necessarily for nefarious reasons. And so we continue to research, we continue to collaborate with other organizations that are working on this process as well to see if we can sort of do some knowledge sharing and figure out what's going on a little bit behind the scenes. But many of these technologies do have user guides and developer guides, and they give very high-level overviews of the types of information that they're collecting, but they don't get to the sort of the granular data element by data element of what's being collected and what's being transmitted. And that has led to a number of discussions between our clients and these tracking technology providers, for example, again, in the healthcare space, as to whether or not they need to execute a business associates agreement if healthcare information is being transmitted. So there, again, this sort of confluence of technical and legal, it's like what lever can you pull to get the information that you need and figure out what you need to figure out to protect yourself and mitigate your own risk.
That's right. So what should organizations look for?
Yeah, what are some of the lessons learned that we can share with you from having done quite a number of these investigations in a number of sectors, a number of different size websites and mobile apps over the past couple of years? Number one,
this is your favorite.
This is my favorite. If you run those commercial tools, again, they're from the outside, they're not from the inside. So if you run one of those commercial scanning tools, it will tell you it sees like a gazillion different trackers running on the site. And what we have found through our investigations is that sometimes our clients had actually deactivated the tracking technology. So it was no longer actually actively collecting or disseminating or disclosing information, but the remnants of the code were still on the site. So from the outside, it looked like this tracker was operating on the website, which is, again, like where these enforcement agencies and these attorneys are looking to find potential targets for litigation. So they might be putting organizations in their crosshairs because they have not actually thoroughly remediated and removed the code related to these trackers.
On the same vein and equally applicable is think about trials, right? We've all gone and done a free trial of something. Well, what happens if you test out one of these products and forget to remove it when you're done?
Yeah.
That could expose you to the same legal risk here as well.
That was, I mean, we always, when we share our findings with our clients, we usually start sort of saying this is what we found. And inevitably, every time somebody who's managing the website for the client will say, what are you talking about? We got rid of that like 3 years ago. And we're saying, well, the code is still there, even if we see that you're not collecting, but the code is still there. So the next one is third-party components having a digital footprint that may be leveraging unapproved technologies. So again, this is if you are in a larger, more complex organization, there may be different pieces of the puzzle operating different parts of your website or operating a mobile app, and they may be embedding things that they are not feeding back sort of centrally to the organization, that may not be communicated to privacy and legal to get the right privacy policy in place. Similar with these unmanaged technologies, not managed by a centralized tag manager, again, sort of the other thing is we've seen like a lot of these legacy pages. So we see organizations that, for example, ran a fundraising campaign literally 10 years ago, and they left, there's like a video on the fundraising campaign page, and nobody ever bothered to take that web page down, and it still has trackers running on it on the website. So if somebody Googled, they might land there today, even though it's a defunct fundraising campaign.
And this is one that I'm really passionate about because we're seeing this over and over and over, is many organizations are looking to adopt consent management tools or tools that give users the ability to control what scripts, what pixels are firing on the page. But what happens if that's not implemented correctly? I mean, that's like a user going into an elevator, pushing the door close button, but it doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Giving the users the illusion of choice, and that's going to continue to get people into problems, and we're seeing that as a really pervasive issue on a lot of larger websites out there today.
I think also related to this, one thing that we've seen a number of times is like embedded service providers within a web page. So
Yes.
again, we've done a lot of these in the medical space, so we have a lot of examples in the medical space, but they're not the only ones who should be thinking about this. But for example, we did one where we were working with a healthcare organization, and they used, it's very common, they used an embedded third-party platform to do appointment scheduling. So when you go to the healthcare provider's website and you go to schedule an appointment, it actually, like within the frame of the website, bumps you to a third-party platform provider that's embedded without the end user being able to tell. And so Mitch went through and scheduled a colonoscopy appointment and took screenshots about how all this information about Mitch scheduling a colonoscopy appointment on the third-party platform provider was all being collected and transmitted to this third party. And our client, who actually thought they had a pretty good handle and did have a pretty good handle on things, was very surprised to see that with the screenshots that we were able to capture of what was going on. So moving through a little bit, I
We're
want
going
to
to
make
go
sure we
really
have a little
quickly
time.
through this slide before we get to the next one here.
Yeah, so what are we seeing? Again, this is a very, very rapidly moving space. The litigation, all these different legal theories are being tested. Some are being successful, some are not being successful. But the real story is, again, in these enforcement orders, which are not litigation, they're not being dismissed. A lot of companies that are entering into these enforcement orders and consent decrees with the Federal Trade Commission. And one common thing that we see across the board for all of these is, generally speaking, it starts with a privacy policy. Activities going on the website that you can see somewhat from the outside that is not disclosed in the website's privacy policy. So, or the organization will make claims that we don't disclose your information, or we don't just share your information with third parties. Or if you take your time or need help falling asleep at night and read privacy policies to help cure your insomnia, you will often see a line in privacy policies that says things like, when we disclose information to third parties, they may not make independent use of that data. And what was actually happening was some of these tracking technologies were, in fact, making independent use of that data that was sent to them. And that is what has led to a number of these FTC enforcement actions. So there's a huge governance component around this, in addition to the technological aspect.
The only other thing I'll add there is, a privacy policy alone is not enough to protect you. So even if you put
That's right.
all these technologies in your
starting
site
point.
and you write the perfect privacy policy, that's not enough. You still need to be aware of the relevant regulations for your industry, your particular site, and the way in which technologies are being implemented.
So we have some things to think about and some guidance for when you go back home, things to think about with your organization, thinking about sort of who owns the websites. Are they talking to your privacy, your compliance, your legal, your governance people? thinking about what kinds of policy, what kinds of governance do you need around this? Do you need to establish a policy that informs your marketing department about when they assess or evaluate a new technology, who they're talking to, who are they vetting it with, what type of impact analysis are they doing before it's implemented? So these are, just some high-level thoughts and guidelines about where to get started, because we've really learned that it's an unfortunate situation when you are already in somebody's bullseye to come to us and say, we need your help now. So it's really good if you can get ahead of this, even just getting yourself organized, even if you're not doing a deep dive forensic investigation. So with that, we have a couple minutes left. If there are any questions, we would be more than happy to take them.
Thank you. Fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
10 out of 10, despite the lack of physical. Use the mom and pop's bakery example.
Yeah.
Do they actually have, a company, mom and pop's bakery, have to actually install those trackers themselves on purpose? It's not like Meta or Google can go in and do it for them.
That is an amazing question. Yes, you are correct. All of these technologies that we talked about here are things that people are themselves intentionally deploying to their site. These are not dropped on your site without your knowledge by these third parties. There are some exceptions to that, and not to get too far into the weeds, but if you're using a hosted website platform, that like an easy builder website platform, there are considerations that you might want to take into account. We don't see that as often an issue for larger corporate entities.
And follow-up question, the bad guys can though, right? Somehow I've heard about them like
The what?
like
bad guys.
a hacker,
Oh.
Threat actors.
the infamous threat actor. They can still put stuff on a website. And just what's the difference there? Then?
So, well, Mitch can go into a little bit more detail, but threat actors can inject or alter code in the website if the website has a vulnerability in its code. So that's a little bit different than these scripts and technologies that you are proactively embedding in your site. But for sure, threat actors can take advantage and leverage and mess with websites and mobile apps, but they have to find a way in to do that.
Yep.
So either through credentials or through vulnerabilities in the code itself. I don't know if you want to.
We do a lot of investigations of that nature. We haven't seen the convergence of those types of matters with this types of privacy and scanning. But with that said, it's definitely something to look out for. Websites get defaced, right? We see them getting hacked and defaced, and inappropriate content being displayed on them all the time. That's, as Heidi mentioned, usually the result of a vulnerability being exploited, and they'll put their own code on your site. So that can happen. With that said, it's less frequent.
Again, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yes, hi. Thanks for that great presentation. I just had a couple questions. It's from your experience in terms of compliance from companies that you've seen. How many companies, would you say, have been doing tracking cookies and placing them in what they consider necessary states? And then the second one would be when you reject all cookies, but actually they leave the cookie in place. All right, is these conditions you're seeing a lot? Some more technical, some more nefarious.
In terms of the usage of cookies, I think the usage of them is only going to continue to grow. They are driving a lot of very necessary and critical functionalities on websites. Even the consent management tools that give you the option to reject all are often using cookies themselves to enable and to offer you that capability. So that's not going away anytime soon. We see the usage and applicability of those only growing. And your second question there was more about, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? The usage of essential cookies?
Necessary versus accept all.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So reject all, this is what we've seen time and time again, where user clicks reject all on all cookies, but if the tool's not configured correctly, it might still allow a tracker to fire, which is then going to drop a cookie, and now all of a sudden that reject all did no good.
There's actually been a lot of studies also that show that the cookies are being dropped before the user even has the chance to click on the button, whether they want to accept or reject them.
Interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's why if you are privacy conscious, we definitely recommend people checking out tools like Ghostery and otherwise that help you to block and really kind of reclaim control over your privacy if that's something that you care about. The other thing that I think we kind of glossed over just in the interest of time is that Google is phasing out third-party cookies by the second half of this year. That's one of the goals that they've stated as part of their privacy initiative. And so we're going to see an evolution of a lot of these tracking technologies and how they actually achieve their end game in light of that reduced effectiveness of third-party cookies for a vast majority of the user base.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, one quick plug as we wrap up, to follow Stroz Friedberg, to follow us at StrozDFIR on X/Twitter. We'd love to keep you updated on our research, our activities, and keep the conversation going.
Thank you all.
Thank you.